المصطفى نور الهدى يا ربي صل على الحبيب محمد خير الوجود المصطفى نور الهدى.
Today on Live and Local, we're talking about public health, avian flu, and the University Hygienic Laboratory with Dr. Mary Gilchrist. She's an expert on infectious diseases ranging from mumps to West Nile virus to pandemic influenza, as well as bioterrorism. Dr. Gilchrist is the recently fired director of the University Hygienic Lab, the oldest public health laboratory building in the United States. The University Hygienic Lab is Iowa's environmental and public health laboratory. The University Hygienic Lab is now governed by the University of Iowa, and Dr. Gilchrist has lobbied to change that. A bill that would diminish UI control of the lab is now pending in the Iowa legislature. Gilchrist has also asked to change the name of the lab to the Iowa Health Laboratory. She was fired in October 2006 after refusing to go along with design cutbacks to a new Iowa Public Health Lab. Although Vice President of Research Meredith Hay repeatedly warned her not to, Gilchrist voiced her concerns over the compromised lab design to public officials directly, and says at times she was approached by state public officials without her initiating discussion. She was, after all, the director of the State Public Health Laboratory. She filed a lawsuit to get her job and her lab back. In her case against UI President Gary Fethke and Vice President of Research Meredith Hay, she alleges that Hay cut 12,000 square feet of new lab space and that Fethke told Gilchrist, "You stuck your neck out for what you believed in, and we can't live with it." You will hear about her recent trip around the world in just a few minutes. But first, we talked about her lawsuit and her campaign to bring all Iowans the best public health lab. Here's Dr. Mary Gilchrist.
We did talk to the state legislature and to the Congress about the problems in Iowa with the old laboratory building that the hygienic lab has been occupying, and spent a number of years asking for funding for that. Our concerns were that the building is 90 years old now. It's a very, very difficult building to begin with. It was built to be a tuberculosis sanitarium in 1917. It never was intended to be a laboratory. It's very, very challenging building to operate in. It has some safety risks and hazards to the staff because the ceilings are low. There are low-hanging pipes. It's just not at all a good accommodation for a modern laboratory. And one of the things that we did tell the legislators about was our concern for a pandemic of influenza. We said we've made it through anthrax, and anthrax was basically in Iowa just a Category 2 storm, if you pretend like we're talking about hurricanes. We didn't lose anybody. We didn't even get anybody ill from anthrax, but we managed a lot of panic. We made it through the risk of West Nile virus the next year. West Nile virus swept across Iowa in the summer of 2002, and it did kill a couple of people, and I think there were 54 illnesses in that range anyway. And the lab just persevered and worked their heads off. The people were very devoted to that cause, and I called that a Category 3 storm. And SARS, when it hit the next summer, the next spring, 2003, in Toronto, was what I would call a Category 4 storm. It missed Iowa, but it killed, I think, 44 people in Toronto, and there was $1 billion in lost trade and travel in the first year alone, people afraid to come to Toronto. And they've still got a problem with that. And so even though it missed Iowa, the hygienic lab was prepared for it. They were doing testing for SARS during the near the end of the epidemic. They already had the chemicals to do the testing. And we're very lucky that we didn't have the great economic losses that they had. With with a pandemic of influenza, it would be a Category 5 storm, and what we said was the levee is broken. We have to have a new building. We can't sustain ourselves through a Category 5 storm. We need to have what we call surge capacity, where your routine tests are done on your routine testing floor, but in a special isolated area, you do the intense need. You isolate it from the rest. And we designed a laboratory that we thought was ideal, but when in the end it was cut back in size by the university, the net square foot of the new lab is going to only be, and that's the lab part that's contained within the main building, the net square foot for lab space, and that's the important point here. There's some additional space that's there, but it's not for lab space, will be 1.5% larger than the old building, just 1.5%. And we had designed a building with about 15% additional net square feet. Not really a palace, but what we felt was a good conservative amount to provide that surge capacity and other capabilities that were important. So that was what my concern was, because I had already told the legislators that we would be able to provide that surge capacity and protection. I didn't feel that I could remain silent about the cutbacks. It's probably too late. We did the early hearing to try to change the decision, to try to reverse the decision to make the lab smaller, but we weren't able to get that to happen, and it may be too late. The building may be irreversibly made smaller. Public health laboratories are much like the rest of public health. They are basically ignored until something goes wrong, and then it is too late. And so the reason to try to reverse the decision is to not let that happen, you know, and it's been a decision. You have a public health professional who's worked in laboratories for my whole life. I'm 63 years old this month. Versus people that don't have very much knowledge about public health or laboratories. And one really has to ask the question, especially as it was noted recently that the university has got about $400 million worth of building issues out there. What is this $4 million difference? And does it make sense to cut back? It's my cousin in Exira, Iowa, and my cousin in Anita, Iowa, and my cousin in Ankeny, Iowa, my sister in Dysart, Iowa, my sister in Des Moines, Iowa, and all my friends and relatives who are Iowans that I'm motivated to help, all of the people that have so long lived in Iowa, and it's the right thing to do. We did experience, as you know, a great deal of concern with bioterrorism in 2001, and those were all false signals. If we had had a real outcome with bioterrorism in 2001, we would have needed a great deal more surge capacity than we had. We were very lucky that we didn't have, say, thousands of cases of people exposed in a stadium, for example. And the whole country got off lucky because the disease was transmitted by envelopes instead of by airplanes. We were lucky, we didn't expect such a great surge to occur with West Nile virus because it's transmitted by a mosquito, but if somebody had decided to transmit West Nile virus with a more efficient mechanism, we could have had a problem there too. It's not unlikely that we will see new viruses coming into this country on the backs of mosquitoes. Rift Valley fever in the Rift Valley in Africa, for example, not only kills humans, but it kills animals. So if it would come to the populace in Iowa, we would have animals, our domesticated animals would be at risk too. So it would create a need for a surge. SARS, if we had had real cases in the United States, we would need the surge capacity. The most likely need for surge capacity that we understand right now is influenza. It's not the only need because there are viruses potentially that will show up like SARS that we've never identified before. But if you need to be able to test not 500 specimens a day like we did in the mumps epidemic, but several thousand a day, you're not going to be able to do it unless you isolate it offline from your normal area of testing. And that's what you call surge capacity, an isolated area. So it could happen with an influenza outbreak, it could happen with a new virus, or it could happen with a terrorism outbreak. And there is a small surge capacity laboratory built into the new design that was left in, but the part that was eliminated because it was empty space at the time we were completing the design. We left it as empty space at that time because we knew we didn't have enough money to completely outfit it. But we knew that the federal Congress had told us often that if there was empty space, they could easily get money to fill that space. It's just that they had trouble with providing money for bricks and mortar. So we felt comfortable that designing the empty space and then striving very hard to get the money to fill that space with equipment would be the way to go. And we had some very good likelihood that that was going to happen. So other people thought empty space must be worthless. If you look at how much empty space is on university campus at any time in any afternoon, you'll see empty classrooms. They have to build enough classrooms for the busiest time of the day, whatever that is, 8:30 to 11:30 probably. And then those classrooms are empty the rest of the day. Just because they have chairs in them doesn't make them actually in use. So I think you really can't justify eliminating space because it's, quote, empty. You really have to look at what are the options and what are the risks. And I think the risk here is that there'll be a need and there won't be a way to fulfill that need. I didn't give you my full lecture, but if you start in the Middle Ages and you look at the plague, people were panicking. They were leaving their loved ones behind to die in the house, and they were making all sorts of mistakes, protecting themselves in ways that weren't protective. If you move up to 100 years ago today in San Francisco, the plague came back. And it came on the backs of rats that got off the ships in San Francisco Harbor. And the rats got into the neighboring area where the Chinese were living. And they thought, the San Francisco inhabitants thought that Chinese were the source of the problem. And again, we're ready to, cordon off the area. These are terrible people. They must be the source of the problem, but it was the rats. And by that time, 4 or 5 centuries later, we knew that it was the rats. But we only had just learned it. Pasteur and Koch had invented microbiology about 3 or 4 decades before. And so they were about to panic and do the wrong thing and completely isolate themselves from the Chinese when some public health professionals came in and said, no, we have to make sure we know where the rats are, get rid of the rats. And public health started doing this. They would go out and capture rats and check them for the presence of the plague. If they had it, they knew where the infested rats were, and they would go out with rat poisoning. I mean, controlled, thoughtful circumstances. The difference, so incredible. Now we can do the same thing with everything that happens that has an infection attached to it. But we have to be very careful that we do the right thing. We don't increase the panic. We try to minimize the panic. We try to guide people to do the right thing. Sometimes they'll be told some guidelines on how to protect themselves. And that's what we have to do as scientists, be good communicators, to communicate to the public, but also to do the right thing in terms of protection. You have to get ready far in advance when you run a lab. It usually takes several weeks to several months to get a good test together. And so you have to be thinking way ahead of the game. And that's why My concerns are about the future. And the future, a pandemic seems inevitable to most professionals who understand influenza. And so that's one of the bigger issues. But all the other issues, if you just look back over the last 5 years and you look at the mumps, the measles, the monkeypox, the SARS, the West Nile virus, what is the next virus to evolve? We don't really know, but we're not terribly worried about it because we're prepared. Being in Egypt for me was a great experience for a variety of reasons, one of which was being a tourist in Egypt, which I had not done. And I did spend a couple of extra days in the Luxor area, which is south of Cairo, where the Valley of the Kings is located, and a variety of temples. One of the temples that I visited was very interesting to me. It takes 72 days in this temple for the deceased individual's body to become mummified. And the temple is an incredibly large structure, occupying acres, I guess, and with large pillars and drawings and carvings all around. So a very, very perhaps ritualistic kind of situation. But if you look at what has happened as a result of people having gained the expertise in how to make a mummy, you can also celebrate the fact that those mummies provide us with information about diseases of antiquity. People that are excavating mummies and studying them find that there's evidence of tuberculosis in those mummies. They can find the organism still present there. They can find the bone deterioration that was common in untreated tuberculosis that we haven't experienced in the last 50 or more years because we tend to have treatments that work up until recently with very resistant tuberculosis. Even in the drawings or the carvings on the walls, you can see evidence of limbs that are apparently have been destroyed in their function by what looks like polio, a person using a crutch and a very much abbreviated limb structure as a leg. And so they tell us a lot about disease. We know that those people in that time period suffered from some of the diseases that have been more or less eradicated from this globe. There's evidence in some drawings on the walls that have been carved in the walls that smallpox was present. And so we're very happy to think that we as individuals haven't suffered that much from polio, that much from tuberculosis, or that much from smallpox. But our parents, my parents, knew those diseases. And so it's just 50 years that we're away from that. And it's important for us to understand how isolated we are from that time period because we don't carry that history with us. As I'm investigating the beauty of the buildings, the giant structures that these people were able to build, and pondering how they were able to build them, and obviously impressed by their abilities and not so impressed by their abilities to do the science that would have protected them from the disease. I'm thinking about the structures that we weren't able to build in Iowa that would have helped to protect us from influenza. And I'm thinking we need to have good decision-making processes so that we can have the best kind of protection that we can possibly build in Iowa, that Iowans are, I think, do the right thing kind of people, and that's where my mind was slipping back as I was investigating the wonders of one of the seven wonders of the world that I have experienced.
During the hearing contesting Gilchrist firing, UI Interim President Gary Fethke defended the decision to downsize the laboratory. He invoked the opinions of UI Vice President Doug True. True is the Chief Financial Officer of the university and has an undergraduate degree in chemistry. His and Mr. Fethke's expertise on public health lab design has yet to be determined. This last section is Mary Gilchrist talking about what she does best. She was recently sent to Egypt, Nepal, and Thailand to evaluate labs for their preparations to detect H5N1 avian influenza. In these countries, the evaluation team met with country health officials, World Health Organization officials, and embassy staff. They also made first-hand visits to assess the labs themselves. During her time in Egypt, some cases of avian influenza in humans arose while her team was in country. She told me that the headlines in the paper read, "Millions will die," and Dr. Gilchrist said she could feel the pulse of a country on edge. Here she is talking about avian influenza and her work.
One of our roles in evaluating labs around the world was to identify places where things could be done better if possible. And the good news is that around the world a lot has taken place to improve the way that labs can detect the virus. There are a number of labs in Egypt now that can detect the avian flu virus within a few hours. The methods that used to take a few days. And the same is true in Thailand, 14 or 15 labs that can do that. Nepal is soon to have their own detection methods in country. And the reason it's really important is because influenza has a really short incubation period from the time you get exposed to the time you get sick. It's usually just a couple or 3 days, could be a little bit longer. But the lab needs to know, needs to be able to do this identification rapidly, because we won't know, should we have human-to-human transmission taking place in the future, we really won't know for sure early on whether a person has the pandemic strain of influenza or a plain old seasonal strain of influenza like that has been transmitting for several years, for example. We won't know, maybe they have a bad cold or an adenovirus or some other virus early on. And to protect a person with avian flu or any kind of influenza who hasn't been vaccinated, and there will unlikely be vaccine available, Tamiflu is one of the antivirals that can be used. Amantadine is another one, among several others. And in most cases, these need to be administered fairly early in disease. You don't want to have to give it to everybody that has a plain old garden variety cold, because you use up all the Tamiflu, and that will be bad. So you need to be able to give it to the right people, and you need to give it fast. So a rapid test is really important.
Would you foresee vaccines being developed for the avian?
Here is your problem with a vaccine. The country is working on vaccines. The world is working on vaccines. They're working on vaccines against the current strain of H5N1. Now, if that's the strain that causes the pandemic, it will have mutated to another kind of virus by the time it causes the pandemic. The current vaccine might still work or it might not, because the mutation may or may not change the efficacy of the vaccine. So the good news is that we're working on it. We're working on better ways to make vaccines faster. That's the most important thing. The old-fashioned methods have been used for 50 years or more to make vaccines. They take a long time period. They require embryonated eggs. That means you have to have a lot of roosters getting together with a lot of hens to produce embryos. And you have to grow those viruses in those eggs. You have to extract them out, and people that that are allergic to eggs can't take them. So we need better and faster methods that don't require eggs. And hopefully in the next few years we'll have some of those methods. But vaccines take basically years, new ones, to develop. So we have to have our fingers crossed. We have to work on every angle we can. The director of CDC, Dr. Julie Gerberding, recently gave a talk where she said, this is a marathon, this is not a sprint. We have to get ready for the marathon, and how to cause people to be just worried enough to Now, make sure that our Congress people vote for the funding to bring the vaccines and the antivirals to reality without worrying so much that they're paralyzed in fear is what a public health person has to try to do. And you don't want to over-alarm, but you don't want to under-alarm people either. You want to tell them somewhat the closest you can to an approximation of reality. I don't think anyone knows how long it will take from the first detection of human-to-human transmission for the virus to spread around the world and greatly impact the world. But if you look at 1918, you can devise a bit of a worst-case scenario. And that is if you focus solely on the fall of 1918. Quite incredible data. If you look at the difference between the first week in October and the second and the third week in October, what you see is just tremendous increase in the death rate. It went from, in Waterloo, the Courier in Waterloo was saying, there's no cause for alarm in the city on October, I think, 5th. And a few days later, all the businesses are shutting down, you know, right, the headlines, everything. In the first 2 weeks after the first cases of influenza were beginning to be recognized, Iowa had 70,000 cases and quite a large number of deaths. But we know a lot more about influenza than they did then. And looking back, they actually were having cases, milder cases, in the spring. So what is the truth about how long it would take for any given virus to transmit around the world once we detect it in our early detection schemes that we have now? A week could be the worst case scenario. A few weeks to a few months might be sort of an estimate where we would have time during that time period to actually make a difference. We could say there are cases that resemble influenza in a city in northwest Iowa, and we test them really rapidly, and they're not influenza. We wouldn't have to send our resources to northwest Iowa at that moment. We could keep them in a town in southeast Iowa, for example, where there were truly documented cases. And the control of influenza right now that we have, the capability to control it, is based on trying to contain it, make people stop interacting with one another, keep them home from school, keep them home from their businesses, and bring in the antivirals wherever possible. And that's all we have, and we can't exhaust those antivirals early on because that will mean we won't be able to do much later on. So the earlier we can direct our resources to the right place and not to the wrong places, the better off we're going to be, and that's why you need that rapid, intense testing.
Thanks for watching. I'm Adam Burke, the production coordinator for Live and Local on PATV. The topic for this program was chosen by me, but it doesn't always have to be that way. You can send in your ideas for a show, and if you want to host a program about a local issue, I'd like to meet you. Give us a call, 338-7035, or email us with your ideas, liveandlocal@patv.tv. And check out our website for more great videos and information, www.patv.tv.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله